So I found that whenever I'm feeling overwhelmed or I'm like stumped on something at work, I'll just look out the window for like 30, 40 seconds at a time. Research is showing that that's enough to really give the brain a break.
Welcome to Jumpstart Your Joy. This season is all about intentional comfort, and we'll be taking a look at the crossroads of the inspiration, intention, and action that you can take to bring more comfort and joy to your everyday. This is your host, Paula Jenkins. Welcome to episode 325 here on Jumpstart Your Joy. I am really excited this week to be revisiting the interview that I had with Emma Loewe, who wrote the amazing book, Return to Nature. It came out this last year, and as I've been thinking about the episodes that have been part of season 7, which has been all about intentional comfort, I knew I really wanted to revisit this conversation because it really stands out as something that I found myself just talking about again and again. This means that I shared it at Kenneland camps when I was working on their mindfulness program. I've talked about it a bunch of times in these episodes, and I can feel that it kind of wove its way into my life, and I wanted to reshare it with you. Before we get to this conversation, I want to wish you all a warm welcome. I hope you are having a lovely mid-August here in 2022, and that you're able to really savor some of this summer in an intentional way and find some comfort to sink into. If you're new to the show, I want to say I'm so glad that you are here. Jumpstart Your Joy started in 2015. Oh my goodness. I'm crossing the marker into 8 years of podcasting. And with that, I'm really excited to announce that for the third time, I will be speaking at She Podcasts, which is a podcasting conference in Washington, D.C. this year, and it will be in October. Really honored to be asked to return. And if you also are a podcaster and you want to tune into a new show that I've been doing over on YouTube with Marian Abrams of Grounded Content. Our show is Podcasting and Content Creator Insights, and you can find it at podcastingcontent.com. Also, if you want to find links to Emma's book or the things that we talk about in this episode, you can find the episode notes or show notes for this on the website at jumpstartyourjoy.com. It'll be on the homepage when this comes out. Or just tap through on your podcasting app and you'll find it under a section that I list as resources. So let's take a look at this episode with Emma. I just truly enjoyed reading her book. I felt like this offered so many inspirational insights about why and how nature is so restorative to humans. And I had never really thought about the science behind it. I love that Emma dives in and shares that with us. And I also really love that we get to know more about how you can tap into that restorative nature of different kinds of landscapes and bring it into your life. So maybe as we're getting through the end of summer, you have an opportunity to go find one of these landscapes and experience it in a new way. I highly recommend that you do that. You may never look at trees the same again after you hear her talk about how they are full of fractals. So let's just jump right on into this conversation. Welcome to the show, Emma Loewe.
Thank you so much for having me, Paula. Excited to be here.
Let's talk about the first question, which is tell us what you loved most as a child or in school. What were your earliest sparks of joy?
For me, one of my first real memories of joy is watching the movie Flipper. I don't know if you're familiar, but it's a movie about a dolphin. And I've always been just like a water lover, and watching that movie and seeing dolphins on TV, I just became really obsessed with them. And, you know, like a lot of kids, I wanted to be a marine biologist and just spend all my days with dolphins. So maybe that was one of my first sort of inklings that I would go into a more environmental path.
I love that. And I loved Flipper. I think the thing that intrigued me about Flipper was that he could communicate with the humans. And like, I wanted to know how that worked. Like,
oh yeah. I felt like he was talking to me in the movie.
Yes.
It was really transcendent for me.
I love that too. Yeah. Yeah. And it is so magical to see dolphins. You're the co-author of the Spirit Almanac and mindbodygreen senior sustainability editor. There's a lot of writing in your history, but this book, it really feels, it's special. And it feels like it came from a very like a personal place, like a place of passion for you. How did you come about with the idea and get to writing it?
Well, thank you. I think that that's a compliment that it comes across that way because I certainly feel, very passionate about this topic. I think for me, I've been working sort of at the intersection of environment and health for quite a few years, and it's always just been a fascinating topic to me. And, you can look at it through a more negative lens of, okay, this is how climate change is going to impact our health in the future. But then on the flip side, there's also the aspect of getting out into a world that is protected and lush and beautiful can be so restorative for us as, a human species. I've done a fair amount of the doom and gloom reporting, but I also just wanted to dedicate some more time to just exploring, really what it is about nature that can be so restorative for us.
And it does feel like there's that balance held in the book of, well, what? There's that moment where you're like, it is restorative to us, and yet we're not treating this planet very nicely right now. And so it's interesting that obviously these things are connected, but I don't know. That's probably the place where I sit, which is sad, but clearly there's things that we can do.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that was, another big sort of goal of the book was when as a journalist, I got the pleasure of talking to a lot of really incredible environmentalists and, environmental activists. And one question that I often ask them is or what inspired them to get started in their line of work. And I think that oftentimes they would point to a certain experience that they had in nature. So I think that sort of made something click for me, as in like, oh, not only is like getting outside in these places healthy for us, but it can perhaps start a sort of relationship with nature that can also be beneficial for the planet and sort of set us on new paths towards sustainability. So that was my twofold goal with the book.
You mentioned early in the book that there was an experience that was so profound for you of sitting in a tree and kind of daydreaming. And I know I shared this too, that so many guests, when I asked that first question, one of the top things is spending time in nature is one of those things that they associate with having brought an immense amount of joy as a child. And so I think there's something really interesting that starts to weave through for me, at least in the context of this show, is that it is and like clearly linked to our own well-being, but also it becomes memories that are so formative that sometimes, like you said there in your book, that they're like even more profound than maybe the memory of like what your home looked like.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that a lot of people can point to early childhood experiences in nature as being very formative. And I am very curious as to why that is. I think that part of it, certainly has to do with nature representing a sort of escape or, a place where we as kids can go to explore and see new things that we might not, see in our internal environments. But I was thinking about this a little bit more too, and I suspect that it actually might have something to do also with just the fact that research is telling us that nature is very restorative mentally, and it also helps us be like more mindful in a sense. And I
Mhm.
think by doing that, it almost makes nature experiences stick with us longer just because we are so like present and rooted in those moments. So the tree is certainly one example, but I can think, of multiple points in my life where I have, for instance, I worked in a greenhouse when I was in college, and there's a lot of things about college that I do not remember, but I remember just like every detail of being in that greenhouse. And I think it was being surrounded by plants just made me so much more present in my body.
Yeah, that's so powerful. Because as I was reading some of what you were sharing in your book too, I kind of got pulled back into moments. One, also in college, I worked at a camp. And there was something about the misty dew on the deck on a given morning and, like, the light filtering through from the redwood trees, and it was just this profound sense of everything's gonna be alright, like, this is it, like, this is good. And then other ones, I mean, like, even in grad school, we rented this house, and in the backyard, somehow, there was, like it was an entire field of daffodils in the spring, like, unexpectedly, and we just walked out and we're like, "What is this wonderland?" And just being able to delight in the present moment of beauty was, I think, what is part of what links it for me, but it's so hard to say all of what it is. I think there's something about that too, like you're not being drawn to the television or the like there's not something to interrupt your thoughts, it's that you can just be, which is such a gift.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's an important observation too. And it's one that makes me think about today's, kids. And it makes me sad that I feel like they're spending, it's a generalization, but generally spending more time on screens and indoors. And, especially now with the pandemic, you have to wonder what that's going to do to their like early childhood memories.
Yeah, I have an 11-year-old son, and it's been interesting I actually now work with that same camp. And one of the things they're seeing is like kids get there and they're like, they claim they're bored because they can't have the screens, in just ways that maybe we did when we were kids. It's interesting. I think it will be telling as they get older. I know you also mentioned that you wrote a great deal of this book, found out it was going to be published right before or right during the early part of shutdown and shelter in place. What was your creative process like? I've got to believe it's very different from other writing processes when you're really in it and isolated.
So I started writing this book in April of 2020 and I handed it in April of 2021, really like the peak of COVID. And I think it definitely changed, a lot about what I envisioned my process would be. When I was putting together the proposal, I pictured doing a fair amount of travel and, going to different landscapes and meeting people who were living in them or researching them and having those immersive experiences for myself. It didn't necessarily pan out that way. I wasn't able to do that. But instead, it opened up the doors for me to reach out to more people to interview just remotely. I've talked to, for example, in the ocean section, I talked to a deep sea cave diver and a surf coach and all these folks who had really interesting relationships with that place to learn more about what it was about being, at the ocean that is so special. So I think in that sense, it made the book a bit more of a community effort. I'm happy that it turned out that way because I think it's better to hear it from multiple different perspectives.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think right after this interview will be an interview with a woman who started a podcast the day that lockdown started. It's named Shelter in Place, Laura Joyce Davis. And it was really interesting just to see how for many people, it became a time and a place where maybe we were more creative or we needed an outlet for it. And then we got a little bit we had to figure it out because it wasn't what we had thought maybe it would be. And it was interesting. It's interesting to hear her story of how she podcasted through it. It's just fascinating.
Yeah. I feel like it sort of opened up the world in the sense that it made people a lot more willing to do virtual interviews. And before lockdown, I don't know if I would have necessarily emailed someone who lives in Australia or something because I just figure there's no way for us to really connect. I'm not going to call them or what have you. So having that sort of virtual openness, I guess, that's beneficial.
It's interesting how it opened up doors and forced us to be creative in different ways for sure. One of the things that I really love about your book is that you talk about various landscapes. The way that you've broken up the sections is so fascinating to me because I definitely resonate with the ocean and probably trees and forests most, but I hadn't really thought about how then other waterways like rivers would resonate with some people and be that touch point. But then you also talk about how those different landscapes impact human mental health and give ideas of how we can help support the climate through climate change and what can we do. And so thank you for approaching it this way. It's so fascinating.
Thank you for saying that. I'm so glad it resonated with you.
Yeah, I think it's super powerful. Obviously, I love oceans and coasts. And it's also interesting having had a discussion, strangely enough, in a group of candle makers who they were talking about what does the ocean smell like? And the information that was coming through was the different coasts all smell different. So it was interesting to kind of layer that in and think about how probably coasts are all different for people, but we have similar experiences of them, especially on the memory and mental health kind of front. You share that many people experience comfort and grounding when they look at water. And like you mentioned, there's people that you talk to that are therapists and surf therapists, really interesting jobs. Why do you think that water is so grounding and comforting to people?
So it's a great question. I mean, I think that the beach, it does actually tend, I think, just in very small studies and focus groups, it does tend to be the landscape that the most people rate as their favorite. And I do wonder, what it is about the coast that just draws in so many people. I think to your point about each coast being different, that definitely has, something to do with it. But then there are also these similarities, like the sounds of waves, for example. In the book, I spoke with a researcher who was really focused on auditory things in nature, and he was telling me the sound, you can hear a wave, a soundscape, and even if it's recorded in like the Bahamas or something, it'll still transport you back to a beach that you are more familiar with. And so they found that even just listening to the sounds of waves can be very relaxing to the body and mind. So I think that's part of it. I think the patterns of the waves, the research on this is called like blue space research, but all blue space researchers say that it's just in that sort of like ebb and flow, it almost soothes our brain waves down in a sense to go into that more calm, relaxed state. Obviously, beaches are a place where we go to oftentimes be with other people. They can be a fun place to do recreation and move the body around, which is obviously very healthy, and you can form good memories there. And then, I think the surf therapy side of things is I almost think about it as being the ocean provides such an opportunity to have a new experience and to achieve something new and prove to yourself that you can, surf, you can swim if you're new to swimming, and just overcome those sort of personal barriers. And then once you do that and you have that moment, again, it's like a feeling that you're probably going to remember for a long time just because, you're outdoors experiencing it and you might be with other people experiencing it. Like, I think nature can be a really great conduit for different sorts of personal achievement, and any landscape in nature can do that, I think.
Well, and I'm thinking there's also something about it that generally when we go to the shore, not always. I mean, I went to college at UC Santa Barbara, so I was at the shore. There's no question as to why I went. I mean, they gave me a scholarship, but I was like, I get to go to the school like it's right on the beach. Yes, that's where I'm going. In senior year, I went to the beach every day because I was like, when else do I get to do this? Oftentimes, it's like we almost set the container when we're going to the shore, that it is a time that is away from other things. And I wonder too if like that it's not necessarily that it has to even be a vacation, but I think we even unconsciously set ourselves up for like, I'm getting away. Like this isn't the same as my everyday life.
Yeah, definitely. It's funny you say that too, because one of the main sort of theories as to why getting out in nature is so restorative for us mentally has to do with this idea that nature presents a certain like set of factors that can just be very cognitively restorative. And one of them is like the sense of being away. So stepping outside of your everyday routine and feeling like you're in a new place, which is interesting. But I think about it, and I also think about they've done research to correlate living close to the coast with like decreased rates of depression. They've done this research in the UK. So it does seem like even people who like live on the beach, it's still very, very beneficial to them. It's not something that they've grown immune to, so to speak.
Either they are aware and mindful and appreciative of it maybe, or it's just the great weather means they can get out and be healthier. Yeah, you wonder what goes into that. It's a really fascinating question. There's like a connection here with my other favorite one that I've got to believe there's something there, but it's like the patterns of nature. You mentioned the patterns of waves and like both the wave sign might be similar to brain waves and stuff. And that my other favorite is trees and forests. And you mentioned that there's fractals, which I never thought of, and of course made me think of Frozen, but like that there's fractals in trees. And that might be why it's partly soothing for us to look at them. What else did you find about forests and trees?
Yeah, the forest is super fascinating. This is a topic of a lot of research and coming out of Japan specifically. And a lot of it is actually spearheaded by like MDs, medical doctors. So there's a fair amount of research to actually show like the physiological effects of forests versus, the cognitive. So one of the most fascinating I thought was, researchers in Japan found that after taking a 3-day excursion into a forest environment, people returned with higher, like 50% more activity in their NK cells, which is white blood cell that is like a first line of defense against foreign intruders. So I was really, amazed that it could have that sort of effect on people. And it also, after like a follow-up study 30 days later, they still had higher NK levels than when they had first set out, which I thought was fascinating. And I think that there's a lot of things that go into it with forests. The fractals are really cool, and that's actually something I've been getting a lot of questions about. So I feel like people are really into the fractal stuff. For anyone who's unfamiliar, fractals are essentially patterns that it's like a repeating pattern. It keeps getting smaller and smaller. So you think of tree branches, broccoli is another example. There's been some research to find that looking at fractals or like patterns that are high in fractals can be really cognitively restorative. It can help people like solve problems faster and things of that nature. And there's some theories that it's because like we ourselves have a lot of fractals in our body, and our eyes actually like move in a fractal pattern when we're taking in natural landscapes. So it's almost like we find them innately familiar, which I think is super cool. And another cool example of it from forests is when trees are facing like, trees always give off these compounds called phytoncides, and they actually emit more of them when they're under threat or they sort of sense an intruder coming or something of that nature. The research is also showing that, certain fragrant compounds in phytoncides actually reduce human stress and also increase that NK cell activity. So like something that's like protective for the trees that they give off for their own sort of benefit is also very healthy to us, which I think is just another, beautiful reminder that we're so connected to so many parts of nature.
Right. And so I have to ask, so do they emit more or less of those when they really feel if someone that with poor intentions comes in, let's say they're coming in to deforest, do they start emitting different kinds of chemicals when they feel like they're under threat?
Yeah, so this is a super fascinating area of research that forests have these underground or trees have these underground networks, and it's nicknamed the Wood Wide Web, but it's essentially like a group of fungus that they, it connects them underground, and they sort of use that to like communicate with each other, to use a human word. But yeah, there is research showing that when, things like if a tree isn't lacking sunlight, you can send resources to a tree that is and sort of like share in that sense. That they also think that, or researchers suspect that if a tree is under threat or if there's like a natural predator that's taken over, it sends off these signals to the trees in the area like, hey guys, you should like emit some more protection and look out for this.
Well, and I know I read at some point during the pandemic about how the trees were connected, the Wood Wide Web. I love it. And that they were supporting each other and also communicating in ways, it seemed, that we were not previously aware of. I also love the idea of the forest bath. Now, I've heard of it, but can you explain what is this? Because maybe intuitively we all know what it is, but like, is it a formalized thing, and how does one participate in one if they wanted to?
Yeah, so I think forest bath, the word it's very funny. I mean, it's a translation of a Japanese word, shirin-yoku. So it's not actually bringing a bathtub to the forest, although that sounds soothing too. But it's essentially, a bath in a more like metaphorical sense. So you're just bathing your senses in the forest. So you're, paying close attention to the different sounds, and you're walking slow so you can really take in the visuals. You're smelling those great phytoncides. You're taking in the forest slowly and really bathing in everything that it has to offer. And it's totally something anyone can do. I've gone on like organized forest bathing walks before, which it's almost like a more, combination of a mindful meditation and nature sort of exploration. But it's cool to go under their guidance because they sort of share different practices for hearing things you might not have heard otherwise, or, different ways that you can connect to the landscape. But I would say that anyone can go on a forest bath themselves if they want to.
One of the things that I do really love is, of course, you kind of explain how each of these environments, and there's more, please go get the book. Like, it's pretty awesome to see how the different environments also have an impact on mental health and on restoring humans. But that you also then offer on the climate change side of things, how we can be in support of the environment in which we live in. And I know for me, it's just one of those things where like it's very hard to sit and be comfortable with our existence, knowing that the planet's in a lot of trouble. And it's like that existential dread almost. And then like we move on and we maybe do something like, get a soda stream or whatever, so we don't have as much single use plastics. Are those efforts helpful, or is there some other thing that you can suggest or that you've seen that works better for someone who with truly the best of intentions wants to honor the earth in a different way?
Yes, every chapter has, ways to protect that landscape moving forward. And in thinking about how I wanted to present that information, I knew from the beginning that I didn't necessarily want to give specific actions for a lot of reasons, one of which is just that different people have access to different ways to be sustainable, and telling people to like compost isn't necessarily doable for someone who lives in an area where that's not possible. And it's sort of hard to give sweeping, generalized advice about how to take action. And I think we're seeing that it really doesn't work a lot of the time. How often are we going to be told to fly less or drive less or eat less meat? All those things are great, and I would never discount any steps someone takes to, do their part to be more environmentally friendly. But I ultimately decided to share like mindset shifts for each landscape instead. Sort of a tweak of thinking that can maybe set someone on a different path in terms of how they consume and how they, take action in their environment. So my advice for people who want to get more involved more recently, it's been just to think about where their real passions lie. Think about, where they can have the biggest impact. So if you're someone who is a writer, how can you gear your writing maybe towards sustainable topics? Or if you work in business, how can you help shift your business forward in a more low impact way? But just sort of taking action that feels aligned for you personally. I know it's a really vague answer, but that's sort of my whole point of writing the book, was that when you form these deeper connections to a place, the way forward will probably present itself to you, and it'll be your unique way forward.
Yeah, because it is way too easy to feel like there's all these little things that we get told are the things to do. But you're right. If it's not deeply connected to something that feels like it comes from a place of, I don't know, of who we are, then it's also very hard to sustain, remembering to only buy these products and never fly.
And I would say too, the climate movement really needs everyone from all areas of life to get involved. So I think that's another reason to really just think about what you personally can bring to the table and your unique contribution.
And are there any resources that you would suggest beyond your book that someone could look to find reputable groups? I think that's the other part. It gets overwhelming. You're I don't know who to connect with to help on this topic.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, so it's actually funny you ask, because I'm going to do a plug for another book that's coming out soon.
Please do.
My friend, her name is Heather White. She's an incredible woman, an activist, and she used to be I want to say the director of EWG, something like that. But she has a new book out called One Green Thing. And it is all about exactly that, finding your one green thing and connecting to groups in your area. So she split it up into basically different archetypes that people can identify with to find what green actions might best suit them and their skills and their personalities.
I'll link it up in the show notes for everyone. Thank you for sharing that. Do you have a few favorites of how you find comfort or, I don't know, intentional mindfulness? What are the ways that you go back to as a person to get back in alignment with yourself?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I wrote this book as someone who lives in New York City, so I actually don't have access to as much nature as other people might. So I've really learned to hone in on the tiny sort of pockets of nature that I do get to see daily. So, I have a view out my window of the East River. So I found that whenever I'm feeling overwhelmed or I'm stumped on something at work, I'll just look out the window for 30, 40 seconds at a time. Research is showing that that's enough to really give the brain a break. And it's so much better for you cognitively than just scrolling through your phone, which I'm always tempted to do. I actually went on this walk last week that sort of gave me some new ideas, but I went on a walk through New York City with a naturalist who she was pointing out all these really cool examples of birds and plants and things that I really never would have realized were in the city that you just have to look out for. And once you know that they're there and navigate the city a little bit slower and more intentionally, you can find them. And it's always such a treat and a delight to see things living in the city that you would consider so stagnant. Whenever I have the chance to get away into larger expanses of nature, I do take it. I'm lucky to have a mom who lives in Vermont, so the mountains have become really special landscape. But yeah, I think just making a point to get outside every day and not just get outside and talk on the phone or whatever, but really get outside and see what there is to see and drink it all in and slow down has just been very beneficial to my mental health, I would say.
I like that a lot. I know you also talk about some of those ideas in parks early in the book. I know if I hadn't spent more time in the backyard, then I wouldn't get to see the hawks all the time. Or I almost always reference the ridiculously large artichoke that is growing in our yard, which is great. It has that's a fractal wonderland right there. But yeah, it is interesting what just taking those few moments will do for you. Would you tell us how can people find your book, or if they want to learn more, where should they start and where can they find your book?
Yeah, so I mean, it's available where books are sold. Yeah, you can find it online or in your local bookshop. And yeah, you can find me at my website. It's just my name.com and on Instagram.
Yeah. And what other things are you or have you been working on if people would like to learn more about what you do?
Yeah, so I'm the senior sustainability editor at mindbodygreen. So I do a lot of coverage there. That's a health and wellness website. So I do a lot of writing there. I also do some freelance writing for different environmental publications like Grist, for example. And yeah, that's been my work as of late.
Yeah, and then the last question that I ask everybody is, what are 3 ways that you can think of to jumpstart joy in your life, in the world, or in other people's lives?
The first one would definitely be to get outside and explore an environment around you and really see what it brings up for you and see if it can inspire you on any sort of new path to, self-discovery, to finding new ways to inhabit the world, to inhabit your community. That is number one. I think to get more granular, number two, I wrote a story for mindbodygreen last year around Thanksgiving that was about how to make people in your life feel loved and are cared for around that holiday. And the woman who I was interviewing, this incredible sacred space designer is what she calls herself, but Elena Kilkenny, she told me about the practice of leaving a voice memo for someone. And I feel like since she told me about that, I've heard it a lot more. But just the simple act of, leaving a voice memo, I think is like a really nice way to show someone that you care. And I think they're so much more personal and kind than a text. So yeah, if there's someone I think who, is in your life who you think of, who you want to reach out to, oftentimes that thought, like you think of them at the exact moment when they need, to be reached out to, I think is so often what I find. So yeah, leaving those voice memos, I think is a nice way to spread joy. And the last one is, it's so funny because my mom's name is actually Joy and she's like the most joyful person I know. So I'm trying to think of what she would say. But I think it's just being true to yourself. I know it's really cheesy, but I think it comes across when you are feeling really joyful within, and that sort of gives people permission to feel their own joy. So that's what I would say.
I like that. And I love that your mom's name is Joy. That's so delightful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Emma, for being on the show today and for sharing all these insights and for writing this amazing book.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, Paula. It was fun.
I hope you all enjoyed this episode as much as I did. It is such a treat to have Emma on the show. If you want to find a link to purchase her book, Return to Nature, I'll put that in the resources section of the show notes. Be sure and pick up a copy. And if you want to find out more about Jumpstart Your Joy, of course, everything you need to know is over at the website, jumpstartyourjoy.com. You can sign up for the newsletter. If you're a podcaster, apply to be in my mastermind, which will start up again in October. Next week on the show, I'm really delighted to have a brand new episode coming out, and it is an interview with Renee Linnell. Now, that name might sound familiar if you've been around these parts for a while, and it is because she was on about 3.5, 4 years ago when her first book, The Burn Zone, came out. She is back and she is going to talk about her brand new book that comes out next week, and it is called Still on Fire. And it's a delight. She is amazing. She blew my mind several times during this discussion. So I hope you'll come on back for that next week. And until then, I hope that your days are filled with so much joy.